Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating, impartial analysis of the escalating ideological tug-of-war happening right now inside the Democratic Party. Whether you follow politics religiously or you just kind of want to understand the shifting dynamics of American elections, the source material we're breaking down today gives us a really clear window into a party that's standing at a major crossroads.
Here's how we're going to break it all down today. First, we'll look at the progressive grassroots strategy. 2, pressuring the Democratic establishment. 3, policy shifts in blue states. 4, the Republican countermessage. And finally, number 5, testing the big tent. All right, so let's kick things off with a defining quote highlighted in our source material from Senator Bernie Sanders. "We are a movement to elect progressives at every level." Now that right there, that tells you everything you need to know about the core progressive strategy. It's not just about the flashy race for the presidency. No, it's a highly calculated, methodical focus on local and congressional seats. It's all about building a bench of lawmakers from the absolute ground up. Which brings us to Section 1, the progressive grassroots strategy. Let's look closely at how the Democratic Socialists of America, or the DSA, are actively building their influence.
So the source explains that the DSA is intensely focused on local races to build their momentum, and you might be wondering why start small? Well, winning these local seats becomes a very tangible measure of their power. By targeting down-ballot and local elections, they are basically forcing the political establishment to orient toward their progressive goals. It's a strategy of applying massive pressure from the bottom up, specifically challenging incumbent Democrats who might have been in office a bit too long or who just don't align with this modern progressive vision.
Actually, get this. The source provides a stark, real-world example out in Colorado. A longtime progressive incumbent, someone who had been a Democrat in office since way back in 1997, was suddenly ousted by a brand-new DSA challenger. Talk about a wake-up call, right? This shows that simply calling yourself a progressive might not be enough anymore. If you're viewed as part of the old establishment, you are absolutely vulnerable to this new wave of grassroots challengers. Section 2, pressuring the Democratic establishment. Because as you'll see, this localized pressure isn't staying local. It is sending shockwaves straight up to the very top.
Our source outlines a very clear 3-step reaction cycle here. It's like a domino effect. First, grassroots DSA candidates win those local seats, right? They establish a foothold. Second, moderate or long-time incumbents suddenly face real, credible primary challenge threats. For example, top figures like Chuck Schumer facing potential long-term pressure from politicians like AOC. And then third, just to survive, those establishment figures are forced to adopt more left-leaning talking points to appease this super-energized base.
And we are seeing this reaction at the very highest levels. According to the source, Vice President Kamala Harris has reportedly held private, closed-door readings with progressive figures, people like the New York City mayor and pro-Palestinian activists. This is a direct effort to mend fences and navigate the friction following perceived missteps during the 2024 campaign. It perfectly illustrates how top-tier Democrats are having to recalibrate to keep the progressive wing engaged. So the crucial point here is that all this tension is severely testing the limits of the Democratic big tent. Now, if you aren't familiar, a big tent strategy attempts to encompass a wide and sometimes very conflicting spectrum of beliefs. The party is currently struggling to balance the desires of, say, working-class union Democrats or moderate farmers in the Midwest with the demands of a highly energized, far-left progressive base. It's stretching at the seams. Moving on to Section 3, policy shifts in blue states. What exactly happens when this intense internal party friction moves off the campaign trail and actually translates into state-level policy? Well, the explainer highlights New York State as a prime example of this pressure becoming reality. Historically, New York actually had a more moderate stance on sanctuary status and ICE cooperation than a lot of people realized. But to appease that growing progressive wing, the governor rapidly adopted strict new measures. We're talking pushing back against ICE detainers, implementing mask bans, and enforcing badge identifiers. It was a rapid flip-flop driven directly by that internal party pressure we were just talking about.
But, actions always have reactions. These sudden policy shifts immediately triggered a fierce legal and operational backlash from conservatives. The Trump administration's reported response to New York was incredibly blunt. "Perfect, we're going to sue you, but we're also going to surge you." This just shows how internal Democratic shifts immediately become massive flashpoints in the broader national conflict.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, the Republican countermessage. Let's examine how the Republican Party is attempting to politically capitalize on all this internal Democratic friction.
The source notes that Republicans are aggressively framing the DSA's rise as a radical threat, basically drawing a line in the sand. They're pitching their own stated goals as common-sense economics, lowering housing and gas prices and seeking bipartisan compromise. On the flip side, they are branding the DSA's influence within the Democratic Party as an agenda of open borders, defunding the police, and fundamentally dismantling American institutions.
And to fuel this narrative, conservatives point to very specific Democratic proposals. For instance, the source mentions Democratic Representative Jared Huffman's proposal to aggressively investigate upcoming 4th of July Freedom 250 celebrations if Democrats retake the House. Republicans are grabbing onto talking points exactly like this to argue that the progressive left is actively abandoning traditional American patriotism. To further hammer this home, conservatives are weaponizing polling data. One poll cited in our source claims a pretty stark contrast, a near-universal 99% rate of patriotism among Republicans, contrasting that with the deep ideological split regarding American sentiment among Democrats. Now, whether you agree with the poll's methodology or not, it's totally clear that Republicans are using these numbers to paint the modern Democratic Party as fundamentally divided on the concept of loving America.
This highly polarized rhetoric ultimately culminates in stark warnings from the right. By framing the progressive movement as literally a communist revolution, as quoted in the source, conservatives are weaponizing the DSA's momentum to mobilize their own voter base. It's a calculated strategy of making moderate voters fearful of what the Democratic Party is becoming.
Section 5. Testing the Big Tent. So, where will this ideological battle between the progressive push and the conservative pushback actually be decided? The source points to the upcoming Senate race in Maine as the ultimate testing ground. It perfectly encapsulates this whole dynamic. On one side, you have Graham Plattner, a candidate backed by Bernie Sanders who takes a hardline stance pushing back against ICE. And on the other side, you have Susan Collins, a Trump-backed Republican who historically appeals to moderate Democratic voters. It is a literal head-to-head clash of these two diverging ideologies.
And the crucial question the source raises regarding races like the one in Maine is this: will moderate Democrats, like those patriotic farmers in the Midwest or centrist in the suburbs, stay in the Democratic big tent? Or will they vote Republican out of guilt by association? I mean, if a moderate voter feels their party is being hijacked by far-left ideologies they just don't agree with, are they going to cast a protest vote for the other side?
And by the way, Maine isn't the only place to watch. The source indicates we should closely monitor a few other upcoming battlegrounds too. The Los Angeles mayoral race, where a DSA candidate might challenge Karen Bass, is a massive local test. Plus, we need to keep a very close eye on Chuck Schumer's long-term vulnerability in New York. These races are going to serve as the ultimate barometer to measure this progressive movement's true strength. Ultimately, this brings us to our final thought for today. As the progressive wing gains momentum, unseats longtime incumbents, and forces these state-level policy shifts, can the Democratic establishment stretch its tent wide enough to keep everyone inside? Can a single political party hold deeply opposing ideologies without totally collapsing at the ballot box? That is the multi-million-dollar question that voters will be answering very soon. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on those local races. They are telling a much, much bigger story.